There is a story that moves through certain corners of the internet in a low and knowing voice, about an old Lakota man on the Pine Ridge Reservation who sat down in front of a tape recorder in the summer of 1955 and described the thunder beings, not as metaphor, not as folklore, as a report. He is supposed to have said that the Wakinyan, the winged powers of the West, were real, that they had come onto the plains long before the Lakota and would remain long after, and that what he was about to say had been kept from white ears on purpose. The recording, so the story goes, was made by a university man who understood too late what he was holding. It was never transcribed. It was never published. The reel was filed somewhere, or lost, or taken, and the old man died before anyone thought to ask him a second time. That is the story, and like most stories of its kind, it arrives with no name for the old man, no name for the university. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. No catalogue number, no archive, no box on any shelf. It is a story about a document that cannot be produced, which is a very particular kind of story, because a document that cannot be produced can never be shown to be wrong. It is safe forever. It grows in the dark and answers no questions. But the thunder beings are real in the only sense that concerns us here. They are real in the record. And that record is so large, so thoroughly written down and sung into machines and printed and reprinted across a full century, that the idea of one suppressed reel misunderstands the entire history of how the Lakota were studied, and by whom, and for what. To see why the missing account is unnecessary, you have to know what was already on the shelf by 1955, and to know that, you have to begin with who the Wakinyan actually were, in the words of the people who kept them. In the older Lakota understanding, the world is arranged by powers, and the powers of the West are the Wakinyan, the thunder beings. They live in the far west, at the edge of the world, on a high place beyond the pine, and they are the storm made into persons. Their glance is lightning. Their voice is the thunder that walks across the grass in the summer. They are said to be terrible to look upon and impossible to describe cleanly, which is itself part of the description, and they carry an old enmity against the Unctehila, the great water monsters of the deep and the rivers, so that the storm breaking over a slough or a river bottom is the oldest war on earth still being fought where anyone can watch it. The Wakinyan are not gentle. They are cleansing and dangerous at once. They bring the rain that makes the grass, and they kill the man caught in the open on a bare ridge. And here is the part that matters for a story about something that was never published. Among the Lakota, a person who dreamed of the thunder beings, who dreamed of lightning or of the winged ones of the West, was marked. That dream was not a private possession to be carried quietly to the grave. It was a debt that had to be paid in the open. The dreamer was obligated to become Hyoka, a contrary, a sacred clown, and to perform in front of the whole camp, doing everything backwards, saying the opposite of what was meant, behaving absurdly, riding facing the tail, plunging a hand into boiling water and claiming it was cold. The Hyoka was funny on purpose and holy for the same reason. Because the power of the thunder beings was too large and too raw to sit inside one person without discharging, and the discharge was public. A thunder dream kept secret was not a treasure. It was a danger to the dreamer and to everyone near him. It could bring the lightning down onto his own family. So consider the shape of the legend against the shape of the belief. The legend says an old man received the deepest truth of the thunder beings, and it was hidden, sealed, kept from the community and the world. The tradition says the exact reverse. A true thunder vision in the Lakota world could not be hidden. It had to be given away, acted out, made ridiculous and public and shared, or it would turn on the one who held it. The one thing the Wakinyan would not tolerate was a private, unpublished account. The Hyoka exists because the vision must be released. Whoever built the legend of the sealed 1955 reel was describing a thing that Lakota religion is specifically designed to make impossible. Now to the shelf, to the record that was already there. The written study of Lakota belief did not begin in 1955. It began in earnest more than half a century earlier, and it began at Pine Ridge itself, with a physician. James Walker arrived at the Pine Ridge Agency in 1896 as the agency doctor and stayed until 1914. He treated tuberculosis, he set bones, and he did something that most agency employees never bothered to do. He asked. Over years he earned the trust of Oglala holy men, men whose names were George Sword and Finger and Little Wound and Ringing Shield and others, and they taught him. They taught him the structure of the sacred, the classes of spirits, the ceremonies, and the powers, and among the powers, at length, the Wakinyan. Walker wrote it all down. He filled notebooks and loose sheets, and typed pages with a system of Lakota cosmology more complete and more carefully sourced than almost anything gathered before or since. And then, in one sense, the legend of the buried account almost comes true, except that it is true in the most ordinary and disappointing way possible. Walker's great manuscript was not published in his lifetime. He published a portion, an account of the sun dance, through the American Museum of Natural History in 1917. The rest, the vast remainder, went into an archive. It sat in the collections of what is now History Colorado in Denver for decades. Scholars knew it was there. It was not sealed by any government or hidden by any secret order. It was simply unpublished, in the way that oceans of academic material sit unpublished, because the labor of editing it was enormous, and because much of it was sacred and difficult, and no one wanted to be the one to handle it wrong. It came out at last in the 1980s, when the anthropologist Raymond DeMalley and the scholar Elaine Yana edited the Walker Papers into 3 volumes, Lakota Belief and Ritual, Lakota Society, and Lakota Myth. In those pages, the Thunder Beings are described in detail by named Oglala authorities, recorded on paper before 1914. So the honest version of the missing reel story is this. There really was a great unpublished Lakota account of the sacred, and it really did include the Thunder Beings, and it really did sit in a box for most of a century, and when it finally came out, nothing exploded. There was no suppressed secret about the true masters of the plains. There was ethnography, gathered with care, delayed by neglect, and released in full to anyone who wants to read it now. And the deepest irony sits inside those volumes, because the single most important contributor was not Walker at all. He was a Lakota man named George Sword, an Oglala who had been a warrior and then became a captain of the reservation police, and who came to believe that the old knowledge was dying and had to be written down before it went. So he wrote it himself, page after page, in his own hand, in the Lakota language, setting down the ceremonies and the powers and the order of the sacred world as he had been taught it. Walker did not pry the account out of a reluctant informant and then lock it away. A Lakota holy man and headman chose, deliberately, to record his own people's account of the Thunder Beings so that it would outlast him, and it did outlast him, and it still carries his name today. The legend needs a white outsider who steals the truth and hides it. The record hands back a Lakota author who set the truth down on purpose, in his own language, precisely so that it could never be lost. Walker was not alone. In 1911 and after, a woman named Frances Densmore came to the Standing Rock Reservation with a machine and a supply of wax cylinders and recorded the Teton Sioux singing. She recorded the songs of the societies, the healing songs, the war songs, and yes, the Hayoka songs, the thunder songs, sung by the men who had earned the right to sing them. She published the result in 1918 as Teton Sioux Music, a Bureau of American Ethnology bulletin that is still in print. The voices of Lakota men from before the First World War, singing the songs of the Thunder Beings, are not lost. They are recorded, catalogued, and archived in Washington, and copies have since gone back to the reservations that gave them. And there is Black Elk. Nicholas Black Elk, the Oglala holy man, gave the poet John Neihardt a long series of interviews in 1931, and out of them came Black Elk Speaks, published in 1932, one of the most widely read accounts of native spiritual life ever put into English. At the center of it is a vision Black Elk received as a boy, and at the center of that vision are the thunder beings of the West, the horses of the 4 directions, and the grandfather powers who send the boy out with the cup of water that is the power to make live and the bow that is the power to destroy. The Thunder Beings are not a rumor in Black Elk Speaks. They are the engine of the whole book. Black Elk lived until 1950. 5 years before the supposed secret reel, the most famous Lakota account of the Thunder Beings ever recorded had already been in print for 18 years and was on library shelves across the country. Then, in 1953, only 2 years before the date in the legend, a scholar named Joseph Epis Brown published The Sacred Pipe, an account of the 7 sacred rites of the Lakota as told to him by Black Elk near the end of the old man's life. It too was in print, in bookstores, taught in universities, by 1955. So the year the legend chooses for its buried secret is not a year of silence. It is a year sitting in the middle of the most active, most public period of Lakota religious documentation there had ever been. The shelves were full. The idea that the real account had to be whispered onto one hidden reel is not just unsupported, it is backwards, in the exact way the Hyoka is backwards, and not on purpose. There is one more name worth speaking, because she cuts against the whole frame of the legend. Ella Deloria was a Dakota woman, born on the Yankton Reservation, raised in the language, and trained as a linguist and ethnographer who worked for years alongside Franz Boas at Columbia. She was not an outsider collecting curiosities. She was a native scholar recording her own people in their own words, publishing Dakota texts in 1932 and speaking of Indians in 1944, working straight through the 1950s. The notion at the heart of the legend, that only a white university man could ever have held the true account and then buried it, erases people like Ella Deloria entirely. The Lakota and Dakota were never only the subject of the record, they were also its authors. So the meteorological point, briefly, because it deserves saying plainly, the northern Great Plains has one of the most violent skies on Earth. The supercell thunderstorms that build over the high plains in summer are among the largest and most dangerous storm systems the planet produces, throwing hail the size of fists, spinning off tornadoes, and killing with lightning on open ground where there is nothing taller than a person for miles. A people who lived their whole lives under that sky, who watched the black wall come in from the west, trailing lightning, and heard the thunder roll across 100 miles of grass, did not need a lost civilization to teach them to take the storm seriously. They read a real and lethal sky with precision and built a theology equal to it. A rider caught in the open when the western sky turned black knew that the difference between reverence and death was whether he respected the powers overhead, and that was never superstition but plain survival. The Thunder Beings are not a garbled memory of something else. They are an exact response to the plains themselves. If you want a true story of suppression, the record hands you one, and it is far heavier than a lost reel. Beginning in 1883, the federal government issued what were called the Religious Crimes Code, a set of rules enforced through the reservation courts that made the old ceremonies punishable offences. The Sundance, the central rite of the Lakota year, was banned outright. Holy men could be jailed or have their rations cut for leading it. The dance did not stop. It went underground, held in secret in remote camps, moved sometimes onto the 4th of July so that a gathering of Lakota in their regalia could be explained to an agent as nothing more than patriotism. That ban stood, in one form or another, for roughly half a century, until federal policy reversed course in 1934. So, when the legend imagines a single account of the sacred being hidden away in 1955, it is imagining a small and fictional version of something that actually happened on an enormous and thoroughly documented scale. The ceremonies were not whispered onto one reel and lost. They were outlawed by name, in writing, and the paper that outlawed them still exists in the files. The same years brought the boarding schools. Children were taken from the reservations, sometimes by persuasion and sometimes by force, and sent to distant institutions like the one at Carlisle in Pennsylvania, whose founder summed up the purpose in a phrase that has never lost its chill: to kill the Indian and save the man. At those schools, the children were forbidden to speak their own language and were punished when they did. The plan was not to hide the Lakota account of the Thunder Beings in a vault. The plan was to make certain the next generation could not tell it at all, by removing the language it lived in and the ceremonies that carried it forward. That is the real mechanism of erasure, and it required no secrecy whatsoever, because it was announced policy, printed in the annual reports of the Indian Office, and defended out loud as kindness. Set that beside the legend of the sealed recording, and the legend shrinks to what it truly is: Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. A small manufactured mystery propped up in front of a very large and entirely visible crime, which is where the story stops being about a reel of tape and starts being about the ground the storm falls on, because there is an economic history underneath all of this, and it is the part the legend is built to keep you from looking at. The thunder beings are the powers of water and rain and grass, and the true history of the Lakota is a history of who came to own the water and the rain and the grass, one instrument at a time. Start with the language of the treaties, because it gives the whole game away. When the United States made its treaties with the Lakota in the middle of the 19th century, at Fort Laramie in 1851 and again in 1868, the promises were written in the formula of the age, the promise that the land would be theirs as long as the grass should grow and the water should run. That was the currency of the words, grass and water. The very powers the Wakinyan governed were the powers named in the contract, and the contract, everyone would learn, had a shorter life than either grass or water. The 1868 treaty set aside the Great Sioux Reservation, all of present South Dakota west of the Missouri River, and recognized a vast, unceded hunting territory beyond it. Within a decade, the Black Hills, the heart of that reservation, were taken after gold was found in them, and that theft has its own long story that has been told elsewhere and does not need retelling here. What matters for the thunder beings is what happened to the grass and the water after the hills were gone. The first power to come onto the plains was not a spirit, it was a market for hides. The buffalo, the animal the entire Lakota economy rested on, the walking commissary that gave food and shelter and clothing and tools, was converted in the space of a single generation into a commodity priced by the pound in eastern tanneries. The railroads carried the hunters out and the hides back. The herds that had darkened the grass were reduced to bones, and the bones themselves were gathered and shipped east to be ground into fertilizer and to refine sugar. Army officers understood exactly what the slaughter accomplished and said so plainly. Destroy the buffalo, and you destroy the independence of the Plains nations, because a people who cannot feed themselves must come to the agency and take the ration and sign what they are told to sign. The grass remained. The animal that turned grass into freedom was gone, on purpose, for the trade. Then came the instrument that did the deepest and quietest damage of all. And it was not a gun or a railroad. It was a survey line and a filing cabinet. In 1887, Congress passed the General Allotment Act, known as the Dawes Act, and it changed the very thing land was. Communal territory, held by the people as a whole, was to be broken into individual parcels, a fixed number of acres assigned to each head of household, the rest declared surplus and open to white settlers. 2 years later, in 1889, a commission came to the Lakota and pressed them to accept exactly this. The Great Sioux Reservation, that solid block of country west of the Missouri, was carved into 6 smaller reservations, the names now familiar: Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, Lower Brule, Crow Creek, with open land between them. 9 million acres passed out of Lakota hands into the surplus and onto the market. The people were pressed and threatened and told the alternative was worse, and enough signatures were gathered, and it was done. Allotment was a repricing of the world. Before it, land was a relationship. After it, land was a parcel, taxable, sellable, mortgageable, and above all divisible. When an allotee died, the parcel did not pass whole. It split among the heirs, and then among their heirs, until a single 80-acre allotment might have hundreds of owners, each holding a sliver too small to use, the whole thing frozen, unfarmable, unsellable, generating a few cents of lease money mailed out to people who had never seen the ground. This is called fractionation, and it was not an accident. It was the mathematical result of forcing a communal people into a system of individual title. The Lakota spent the 20th century tangled in it. The courts eventually noticed. In 1987, the Supreme Court struck down a clumsy federal attempt to solve fractionation by simply seizing the smallest shares. Decades later, the Cobell Settlement, the largest the government ever made with native people, set aside nearly $2 billion just to buy back fractionated pieces and consolidate them, an admission in cash that the survey line of 1,887 had made a permanent wound. It was into the middle of this collapse, the buffalo gone, the hills gone, the land breaking into parcels, the ration line replacing the hunt, that the last great prophetic movement came. In 1889, a Paiute holy man far to the west had a vision and taught a dance, the ghost dance, that promised the return of the buffalo, the return of the dead, and the rolling back of the whole catastrophe, if the people danced and lived rightly. It spread across the west and reached the Lakota reservations, where it took on a harder edge, because the Lakota had lost the most and most recently. Agents panicked at the sight of it. The army was called. Sitting Bull was killed by reservation police at Standing Rock in December of 1890. And on the 29th of that month, on a creek called Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the 7th Cavalry surrounded a band under the leader called Spotted Elk, or Big Foot, who had come in sick and seeking safety, and opened fire with rifles and rapid-firing Hotchkiss guns. Something close to 300 Lakota died, many of them women and children shot as they ran. They were buried in a mass grave in the frozen ground. It was, in the plainest terms, the violent end of the armed history of the plains, and it happened over a dance about bringing the world back. The site did not rest. A trading post rose beside the mass grave and sold to tourists. And in 1973, more than 80 years later, the American Indian movement and Oglala people occupied Wounded Knee for 71 days in an armed standoff with federal forces, demanding that the old treaties be honored and the corruption on the reservation be answered. The years around it on Pine Ridge were violent and dark, a period the community itself remembers as a kind of siege. The point is that the wound named by the legend, the sense that something enormous was taken and buried at Wounded Knee, is real. What was buried there was not a reel of tape. It was people, and a promise, and the last open resistance to the pricing of the plains. And then the water itself was taken, which brings the thunder beings all the way home. In the 1940s, the federal government designed a vast program to dam the Missouri River, the Pick-Sloan Plan, a chain of enormous earthen dams for flood control and power and irrigation. The reservoirs they created drowned the one part of the reservations that had always been the richest and most sheltered, the timbered bottomlands along the river, where the people camped in winter out of the wind, where the game sheltered, where the wood and the water and the shelter all were. The Oahe Dam, finished in 1962, backed up a reservoir that flooded enormous stretches of the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River Sioux lands, more than 100,000 acres of the best ground, the bottomland economy erased under a lake named, with no apparent irony, Lake Oahe. The people were moved up onto the dry tableland above, away from the river, away from the trees, and compensated at prices they did not set for land they did not want to sell. The dams turned the river from a home into a utility. The water was made into an asset, and the asset was pointed away from the people who had lived on it. There are two Lakota words that carry the end of this story. The first is waziku, the word the Lakota came to use for the white man. It is often translated, in a translation the Lakota themselves have long enjoyed repeating, as the one who takes the fat, the one who takes the best part and leaves the rest. Linguists argue about whether that is the true origin or a later play on the sound of the word, and the honest answer is that the etymology is uncertain. But as a description of the economic history just laid out, the fat of the buffalo, the fat of the grass, the fat of the bottomland, the gloss needs no defence. Something came onto the plains and took the best part, and it left behind a written receipt for every last pound of the fat it hauled away east. The second word is the one that closes the circle. Mniwikoni, water is life. In 1988, Congress finally authorized a project by that name, the Mniwikoni Rural Water System, to pipe treated Missouri River water out to Pine Ridge and Rosebud and Lower Brule, because a century of everything just described had left the reservations without clean and reliable water of their own, drawing on wells that were failing or fouled while the great river ran past behind a federal dam. Water is life, and it had to be brought back and piped in by act of Congress to the people whose treaty had promised it as long as the water should run. And then, In 2016, that same phrase became the cry heard around the world. When the company building the Dakota Access Pipeline routed it under the Missouri River, it first proposed a crossing upstream of the city of Bismarck, and Bismarck objected that a spill would threaten its drinking water, so the crossing was moved. It was moved to a point on the river just above the Standing Rock Reservation, under the waters of Lake Oahe, the very reservoir that had drowned the bottomlands 2 generations before. The people who gathered there to stand against the pipeline did not carry a slogan invented for the cameras. They carried Emni Wikoni, water is life. They were standing, in the 21st century, exactly where the Thunder Beings had always stood, at the meeting of the storm and the river, defending the water against a power that had come from somewhere else to take the best part. The oldest war on earth, the Wakinyan, against the monsters of the deep, breaking again over the same water, this time with a corporation on one side and a phrase in the Lakota language on the other. The pipeline was finished, and it runs today, and the legal fight over the crossing has ground on for years in the federal courts, unresolved, the easement contested, the environmental review reopened and fought over. The point is not that the water protectors won, because in the narrow sense they did not. The point is that the story the legend tries to tell of a hidden truth about the Thunder Beings kept from the world is standing there in plain daylight and always was. The Thunder Beings are the powers of the water. The whole history of the Lakota under the United States is the history of the taking of the water and the grass. Nobody hid that. It is in the treaties and the allotment rolls and the dam authorizations and the pipeline easements. It is the most published account there is. It is a public record so heavy and so damning that a made-up secret reel is not an addition to it. It is a distraction from it. And that is finally what the legend of the 1955 recording does, whether or not anyone intends it. It takes a history that is fully documented, fully provable, sitting in the National Archives and the treaty texts and the Supreme Court reporters, and it replaces that history with a mystery that can never be produced and therefore never resolved. It trades the heavy real thing for the weightless false one. It sends you looking for a box that does not exist instead of reading the ledgers that do. The Lakota did not lose their account of the Thunder Beings. Walker wrote it down. Densmore recorded it. Black Elk spoke it into a book. Deloria kept it in the language. The tribes now run their own archives and their own language programs and have brought the old wax cylinders home. The account was never missing. Could there be, somewhere, a real reel from around 1955 of an old man on Pine Ridge talking about the Wakinyan? Of course there could. Thousands of such recordings were made in those years, on reservations all over the country, by universities and folklorists and the people themselves. It would be the most ordinary object in the world. What there is no evidence for, none at all, is that any such recording contained a suppressed secret, or was buried by anyone, or was anything other than one more voice in a record already vast and already public. The only invented parts of the legend are the secrecy and the silence. Everything else was true, and everything else is on the shelf, and everything else is worse than the legend, because it happened, and there is a paper trail. The Thunder Beings were never the thing that was hidden. They were described, sung, published, and defended in the open, exactly as a people who understood the Wakinyan would insist they had to be. What was taken quietly, parcel by parcel and dam by dam and easement by easement, was the water and the grass the Thunder Beings ride. Go and read the Treaty of 1868 and find the promise about the grass and the water. Then go and find who owns the river behind the reservation now, and under what document, and for whose benefit. The account that was never published is a fiction. The account that was published and filed and signed and forgotten is the one that should keep you up at night. Make of that what you will.